I'm Chance Dorland, and this is the Spurs Insider, our weekly NBA podcast from ExpressNews.com. And today, joined by San Antonio Express News sports writer Jeff McDonald. Great to have you back here on the show, Jeff. Always mixing things up as of late, having lots of different voices. Great to have you on the program for today. Really quickly, before we get into some points that you want to make, let's recap the last three games. So we got LA, Dallas, and most recently, Phoenix.
Yeah, and that would be a 3-game winning streak for the Spurs, which is, a positive development for a team that we didn't really know what to make of coming into the season. And they started off about 500, winning every other game, and then they've rattled off this little 3-game winning streak. And I don't think you want to read a whole lot into it because they're playing teams that, as of right now, would not be playoff caliber teams. And in the case of Phoenix, who they waxed last night, probably the worst team in the Western Conference, but they're taking care of the teams you have to beat if you're going to fight your way in the playoffs. And that's kind of what we were looking at the Spurs being coming to the season, is this team that's right there on the bubble. Maybe they're 6-7, maybe they're 8, maybe they're 9 or 10 out of the playoffs as this thing unfolds. In order for them to make the playoffs, it's going to be more important than ever for them to beat the teams that they know they can beat. And so far, they've accomplished that. I think that's, you don't start planning the championship parade around that, but you do, tip your hat to that, because had they lost some of these games, it could come back to bite you, because there's games coming up that are going to be harder to win and that you're not going to be favored in and that you're probably going to lose.
Yeah, so completely agree. LA, Dallas, and Phoenix, 3 wins, but we're not too far removed from that Indiana game as well. So time will tell. Always, hedge your bets a little bit.
Yeah, and until last night against Phoenix, who, again, might be the worst team in the league and was playing without its best player in Devin Booker, until that win, all their wins had been very narrow. Like their most
single
lopsided
digits, right?
Yeah, their most lopsided victory until going to Phoenix was a 5-point win in overtime against Dallas. So those wins even have been sort of coin flip kind of games that they're getting right now, which, again, that's off to the Spurs. You got to get those games in order to keep yourself in a good spot for the playoffs later in the season. But they have they've been playing well enough to win down the stretch. I'll put it that way. They have not been gangbusters. We didn't expect them to be, but they're playing well down the stretch. They've got a closer. We can get to this in a little while. A closer in DeMar DeRozan, which is the type of player they did not have last season with Kawhi Leonard hurt, who can get you those big baskets down the stretch of a close game and get you that game. I think with last year's roster, sans Kawhi Leonard, they're not 5-2 right now if everything else plays out the same. They just would not have had the guy that gets you those baskets down the stretch like they do in DeRozan. And he's got them 3 of those 5 wins. He's made a big basket to either go ahead or seal the game in the waning seconds. So that's something the Spurs did not have last year. They do have this year, and it has helped them out so far.
Yeah, and then speaking of Dallas, I mean, that's not the only game that's gone into overtime, speaking of that type of thing. And because of that, DeMar DeRozan and I believe also LaMarcus Aldridge, I think they were like 1 and 2 for average playing time because of those long games. Yeah,
going into last night in Phoenix, DeMar DeRozan was leading the league in minutes played per game. Right on his heels was LaMarcus Aldridge. They're both in the high 30s. And that's different for a Greg Popovich team, because he's pretty much notorious for keeping his stars kind of in bubble wrap. You want to keep them fresh. You don't want to overplay them. You want them to be fresh as the season moves along, and especially into March and April when you're pushing for that playoffs. It's early, so it's a small sample size. The 2 playoff games, of course, did skew that a little bit. But so far, I think with the injuries the Spurs have, they're shorthanded anyway. And with this idea that they've got to win the games that they can win, I think Pop has taken his hand off the reins a little bit. I think is maybe the phrase I'm looking for, and backed off and allowed his best players to play more minutes in order to get these games. In Phoenix, they won by whatever it was, 20 points, 30 points, and that blowout kind of allowed him to sit those guys in the fourth quarter. And if the Spurs could pull off that a little more often, I think it would behoove DeMar and LaMarcus very much so. I think for now, it looks like Pop wants to avoid just flat resting those guys like he might have done in the past with a Tony Parker or a Tim Duncan or a Manu Ginobili, because they need every game they can get.
Back to DeMar DeRozan, that real unexpected playmaking. I wouldn't say unexpected success. I mean, he's a great offensive player, but some unexpected improvements maybe would be a way to throw it out there, and just the unexpected way that he's really fitting in to what is now the new San Antonio offense. Is this turning out to be a much better deal than anyone anticipated?
Yeah, DeMar DeRozan is a guy that everybody knew. He's an all-star. He's an all-NBA player. You could look at his numbers and you could see that he averaged 22 points or more in the last 5-6 seasons. You knew he was one of the best pure scoring guards in the NBA. But he was kind of tucked up there in Toronto. As a Spurs fan, you only saw him twice a year when they played the Spurs. You didn't really, unless you were just a guy that followed the whole NBA and watched a lot of basketball on TV, no matter who was playing, you probably didn't have a good idea of what DeMar DeRozan's game looked like beyond the numbers you could just type up on Basketball Reference. I think what we're finding out in this system and the way the Spurs are using him, he's a much better playmaker for other players than probably people recognized coming out of Toronto. I mentioned the scoring ability. When you think of a guy that's a pure scorer like that, you think of a guy that he's going to shoot 20 times a game and his scoring numbers are going to be up, but his assist numbers are not going to be high because he's a scorer. He's not a passer. But with the injuries the Spurs have had at point guard, they've run a lot of their offense with the ball in DeMar DeRozan's hand, making a play either for himself or for other people. And his assist numbers have been off the charts. Last year in Toronto, he averaged a career high in assists, about 5.5 a game. I mean, that was a part of the game he sort of added last year, but he was playing next to a guy named Kyle Lowry, who was actually the point guard there, and he was another high usage guard that was going to have the ball in his hands a lot of times. So the offense didn't run through DeRozan in Toronto the way it is in San Antonio right now. And, in that overtime game in Los Angeles, 143-142, DeMar DeRozan had 14 assists, a career high. It was his third game with the Spurs, and he had more assists than he'd had in any other game in his first 9 NBA seasons. And he had another game where he had 9 assists, almost another double-digit assist game. And I think he went into last night in Phoenix averaging about 8, which would be a career high. It would blow his other career high out of the water if he could keep that up for the whole season. So, I think we're seeing a part of his game that I don't think people, unless you were really paying attention to the Toronto Raptors last year, really knew that DeMar DeRozan had. And I think it's really been a boon to the Spurs because there was a hole in that lineup when basically every point guard they had got injured. And they start Bryn Forbes there, and Bryn Forbes has done a nice job, but he's not, if you're watching the games, he's called the point guard, Bryn Forbes is, but he's not the guy that's really running the offense. Once they get set up, he's off the ball. He's playing, off what DeMar DeRozan creates. And sometimes defenses are so focused on what DeMar is doing that, you're going to drift away from Bryn Forbes on the perimeter, and Bryn Forbes is going to have some open shots. And we're looking at Bryn Forbes having one of the better starts to a season for a Spurs quote unquote point guard. He scored in double figures in every game. So, like we were talking about, just everyone knew DeMar DeRozan could score. I don't think we knew he was quite the passer that he was. I think a lot of people in the preseason when Greg Popovich said, hey, DeMar might be the best passer we've got, I think a lot of people scoffed and said, well, it must be because you don't have very good passers on your team or whatever. But he's been a very surprising playmaker, and I think that's something that it's helped the Spurs out immensely in a role that they wouldn't be able to fill otherwise.
So passing, assists, scoring, these are the trappings of offense, which is actually doing pretty well for the San Antonio Spurs. And that's a surprise because they've been known so long as a defensive team. That's a little terrible right now, but you think it's improving. You think there's maybe some improvement there.
Yeah, when the Spurs walked in the AT&T Center on Monday to play Dallas, if you looked up the stats on NBA.com, They were number 30 in the league in defensive efficiency, which is notable because there are only 30 teams in the NBA.
That's a clever way to not make it sound as bad. No, yeah.
Well, here's how it sounds bad. They were dead last in defense, and it was jarring because this is a team that is always, in the top 10, top 5. Last year, even without Kawhi Leonard, they were the second most efficient defense in the NBA. I think as long as Greg Popovich has been there, the worst they've ever finished the season was 11th. So to see them 30th was a little jarring. And you didn't expect them to have a very good defense, especially to start the season. When you talk about all the personnel losses they had over the offseason. I mean, Kawhi Leonard's one, but there's also Danny Green and Kyle Anderson. And then DeJounte Murray, who was going to be the spearhead of your defense, gets hurt in the preseason. He's out for the year. All of a sudden, you don't have defensive guys, and you're just trying to patch it together and hoping just by virtue of the scheme and everyone being on the same page and everybody communicating and basically trying to mask whatever defensive deficiencies you have individually by being just locked in as best you can in terms of team defense. And, they were 30th coming into that Mavericks game. But if you look this morning, they're up to 20th already. And again, at this point of the season, sample sizes are so small that a couple of good games can jump you up there. But I was telling people even as recently as Monday, like there's no way the Spurs are going to end the season 30th in defense. They're going to improve just by the nature of Greg Popovich is a good coach, and these are professional players, smart players, guys with good basketball IQ. They may not be individually the most talented defensive players in the league, but you can drill them to be on the same page, and they can be better than 30th. I was telling people they're going to improve throughout the year, but I still don't think they're going to get up to the top 10. I mean, I just don't think they have at some point you got to have those individual defenders, those difference-making individual defenders in order to have that kind of defense. And I don't think the Spurs have that, but I think just in terms of coaching and scheme and getting to know one each other, chemistry, people think about chemistry in terms of offense when you have a new team, like knowing that this guy's going to cut and I got to hit him with a pass here, or this guy likes the ball this way. There's also a chemistry to defense, knowing when guys are going to switch and how to cover for other people when they maybe get beat. And that's something that will come along as the games go along. So I do expect the Spurs will improve defensively. I don't think they're going to have that brick wall unit that we're used to seeing. But their offense is so much improved that I think if they can get up into the top 15, maybe, I think you're looking at a team that has a pretty good playoff profile if the offense keeps doing what it's been doing.
So let's jump to another topic before we have final thoughts, before we say goodbye here at the end of today's episode. Dante Cunningham really moving up into the starting lineup.
Yeah, and this is sort of related to what we just talked about the defense. He's the closest thing the Spurs probably have to that quote-unquote defensive stopper on the roster now that DeJounte Murray is gone. And I think Pop realizes the starting lineup needs somebody like that with that sort of junkyard dog kind of mentality on the defense, or on the defensive end. And so and to go along with that, I think we've talked about this a lot before. The league itself is just starting to start smaller units and play spread out and fast and smaller and sleeker. And so you can't always start two big men next to each other. The Spurs opened the season starting LaMarcus Aldridge and Jakob Poeltl together, 2 7-footers. That maybe doesn't make a lot of sense against a whole lot of teams that are, and the way they're playing in today's NBA. For instance, when the Spurs went to Los Angeles, the Lakers are starting LeBron James at power forward. You're probably not going to guard LeBron James with either LaMarcus Aldridge or Jakob Poeltl. So that's when Popovich put Dante Cunningham into the starting lineup, put Poeltl on the bench. Now Aldridge is your starting center. He can guard the one big man that the Lakers started, and now Dante Cunningham can guard LeBron James. And there are several other teams that kind of line up that way. And so it makes sense to have Cunningham in the starting lineup. And he's sort of, as he's played more, you've seen the Spurs defense pick up a little bit. And, he's a journeyman. He's played in 10 NBA seasons. He's 31 years old. The Spurs signed him late in free agency on a league minimum contract. Basically, anyone in the league could have had him. I mean, I don't mean this in a poor way, but he's not a special player, but he's the guy that fits with the rest of the guys on the Spurs starting lineup. especially now that DeJounte's gone. You have a lot of Dante Cunningham is not a scorer, you think about the object is put the ball in the basket. So when you say a guy's not a scorer, it sounds like a detriment, but that's actually a reason for having him in the starting lineup right now, because the Spurs have a lot of guys that can score, a lot of guys that need the ball in their hands in order to be effective offensively. If you put a fifth scorer out there, that guy's probably wasted, because DeMar DeRozan and Marcus Aldridge are sucking a lot of that oxygen offensively. So by having a guy that doesn't demand the ball on offense, that can spearhead your defense, I think just as a five-man unit, that makes a lot more sense to Greg Popovich right now. And it sounds like Dante Cunningham's going to be in their starting lineup for the foreseeable future. Now, if they run into a team that's going to start, 2 7-footers, but there aren't many left in the NBA, but if they run into one of those teams, then perhaps you see a Jakob Poeltl or a Pau Gasol back in the starting five for a night. But it sounds like the way things are going, this is kind of the starting five that Greg Popovich wants going forward.
And then, Jeff, got a few moments left. Final thoughts, and what do you think of the upcoming games that the Spurs are going to be hitting up here in a few days?
They got New Orleans coming in here on Sunday. It's a New Orleans-Orlando back-to-back at home, which is rare. You don't usually have a home back-to-back. So that's going to be odd in and of itself. But New Orleans is the first team, and they're really good. That's going to be a tough game to win. They're playing at the fastest pace in the league, I think. Definitely the highest scoring team in the league, I think. So the Spurs are going to have to, all this defensive stuff we're talking about, they're going to have to find a way to sort of slow down that Pelicans attack. And, that's a tall order, especially when you're talking about a guy like Anthony Davis coming in here and kind of spearheading that. And then you kind of get a break. There are no breaks in the NBA when you're the Spurs these days. These aren't the Spurs that are going to be 67-win team. So you can't take a team like Orlando coming in here lightly, especially on the second night of the back-to-back. And I bet if the Spurs had got to choose, I bet they would choose to flip Orlando and New Orleans. Play Orlando first and then New Orleans on that back-to-back, because New Orleans is going to run you. You're going to come out of that game just exhausted. And then you've got to turn around and have maybe the easier opponent on the second night, but now maybe you're in a little bit of a red zone because of all the energy you've expended the night before. I think if the Spurs had their druthers, they'd get the weaker opponent on the first night, kind of take care of that, and then whatever happens the second night happens. But they don't get to make their own schedule. I don't know if you know this. They have to just play the one that the NBA gives them. So that's that. That's the hand they've been dealt. But they'll ride in on a 3-game winning streak. The arrow's pointing up for now, but we'll see what happens when those dastardly Pelicans come to the AT&T Center.
And thank you to San Antonio Express News sports writer Jeff McDonald for joining me for today's episode of the Spurs Insider, our weekly look at the NBA brought to you by ExpressNews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.